One of the most interesting things about the new wave of space games is how they are finally solving a major design problem. That's something we've all experienced with many of the recent games. Many of them promise a complex game and you get vast distances, massive scale, sensors and fleets, as well as the fantasy, of course, of commanding warships. But when combat actually begins, much of that complexity falls away. For example, the ships might enter range, weapons can activate, and you see numbers start dropping. But what should feel like a tense battle, a tense encounter, becomes something much closer to, a numbers-driven game. Now, what makes the latest Fallen Frontier combat update so interesting is that it seems to be moving away from exactly that problem. So most recently, the developers put out a new update onto Steam about Fallen Frontier where they spoke in depth about combat. And it seems that combat's not going to begin with just firing solutions or even with visual contact. It begins with an element of uncertainty, and I think that's a very good start. I think that's pretty much what we'd expect from games centered on war. So this works by at long range, you may not fully know what you're looking at. There's not necessarily an enemy ship that's clearly in sight, and instead you see contacts in the battle space in the environment around you. These signals might be incomplete returns on your radar, in other words, partial information. But this will gradually turn from ambiguity into sure knowledge, and that, perhaps more than anything else, immediately changes the nature of how you engage with combat. So there's a lot to talk about here, and in fact Fallen Frontier is a highly anticipated game. I know a lot of people cannot wait to see this, so the more information we get about it, the better, and it's good to see that it is making progress. Also, if you happen to enjoy videos like this and you haven't done so already, please do consider to subscribing. Now, according to the developer, Fallen Frontier's combat has indeed received some substantial attention, and it shifted away from what could perhaps be considered a bit of an arcade style of model towards something that's far more simulated. So to start with, there's a lot of cosmetic elements to the combat here. You've got a lot of explosions, many bits of ships falling apart and breaking away, and physical firing of all the weapons. But all of that is just cosmetic. There's also a lot of elements in combat that are now structured or structural. So combat has been described now as unfolding across 4 distinct phases, and all of these happen in real time. And that means then, rather than just having a flat exchange of damage in your combat, the battle overall starts to evolve. It's an evolving encounter, and one which, with each stage, ultimately affects the next. And with encounters working in such a way, you might well expect that the first phase will matter a huge amount, and yes, it indeed does. So the opening stage, the first phase, is information acquisition. And it's here that the enemy may be active somewhere in the area of operations where you're actually engaged. But they're not necessarily yet entirely invisible. They're not necessarily visible in the game world environment around you. Instead, you can see objects outside of visual range, but still within the navigational plane that are presented as LiDAR contacts. And as they move closer, they start becoming clearer until eventually you as a player can properly identify what you're seeing. Now, that might sound like somewhat of a small detail, but it does actually in fact change the tone of combat, and in quite an immediate way. And that's because when a battle begins with these uncertain contacts, rather than having the perfect information, what happens is quite interesting, because you're not just simply reacting. Instead, you're having to interpret, and you're trying to understand what is even out there, what state it might be in, and how the battle space around you is starting to take shape. And that's something that's quite apparent in the footage, and recognition itself ultimately becomes part of the engagement. And I feel that this is where Fallen Frontier really does start to separate itself from the more, shall we say, conventional strategy combat games out there. Now, once you know what you're facing, this is where the second phase begins, and this is the missile phase. So missiles, rockets and vertical launch systems, all of these dominate the engagement, and really the purpose is simply to trade, well actually it's not about trading damage at distance. There's a clear objective here, and it's to break something important before the enemy can reach you. In short, don't view this part of the combat as necessarily destroying the enemy, but you want to degrade their capabilities before they get into full range. And as you might imagine, this really changes the concept from being hitting at the maximum amount of damage possible, moved away from the idea of these max numbers, and instead trying to get a few decisive hits onto the ship and ultimately crippling a few of its vital systems. So really, this is all about shaping the rest of the battle. In the footage, we get to see how a frigate hides behind one of the asteroids whilst painting and damaging another enemy. And yeah, some of those missiles actually hit, but others are drawn away by decoy. Others still are confused by the asteroids in the area of operations, and those ones fail to reach the target. So this is a really nice level of detail to a game like this. And it also means that the environment plays an important factor in how the combat unfolds. From there, engagement moves on to mid-range warfare, and it seems to be where the combat system really begins to open up. So by this point, you know more about the battle sphere, you know exactly, well, you know pretty much exactly what's going on, and you know about the enemy's composition, you know what sort of ship they've got, what weapons it's got, perhaps a bit about the electronic warfare, the defences. In other words, you really understand the shape of the combat that you're getting into. And so this is where manoeuvring starts to become central. So ships in a Fallen Frontier at this point are now moving in response to what could be considered the developing tactical picture. In fact, the developer notes here, they actually mention that this phase is often where a second major salvo of weapons can be launched, and assuming the ship still has that capability even, because that may have been knocked out. It's also a case where people will make tactical decisions, such as remaining near asteroid clusters to benefit from their cover, maybe perhaps by confusing the enemy missiles. But it's also the point where the main battle guns start to come online, and these are not necessarily presented as perfectly accurate weapons, except, I guess, in the case of railguns, but they also add a new kind of pressure to the fight. Now, at mid-range, combat becomes less of a one-on-one activity, and it's no longer just about the long-range missile exchanges. Instead, it's getting very close and very dangerous here, because the guns really come to bear, and that means manoeuvre and cover start to play quite a big part, as well as do the support systems of your ship. All of this needs to work together. You go through this process for quite a bit, obviously taking shots and navigating and taking tactical decisions, until eventually you get to the fourth and final phase, which is described as looking at death in the eye. And this is close range combat, as close as you're going to get, and this is where broadsides come into play. So the ships here, they attempt to manoeuvre into the blind spots of their opponents, but even here the game is attempting to retain some sort of complexity. For example, another vessel may already be moved into position that covers exactly the angle you're trying to attack. In other words, the implication here seems to be that close-range combat is not just about being a neat duel, it's something more than that, because it's still part of the wider fleet engagement. Because whilst all of these different phases are going on, of course, you're still a part of another fleet, and there's still other enemy ships as well as friendly ships out there, and some might well be in range. So yeah, it's pretty clear that developers have put a lot of time and attention into how exactly battles are going to play out. A lot of different dynamics going on here, and when you factor in that you can have different modules on your ship, so maybe you've got no electronic warfare, for example, yeah, you can see how that might play out. You're going to have to make different tactical decisions. Let me know your thoughts and feelings on this update, this new information, in the comments section below. Thanks for watching this video all the way through. There is another one on the screen right here. Please do check that out. Do take care, and I'll catch you next time.